I used to believe that order was eternal. That is the lie we tell ourselves to make the waking hours bearable. We convince ourselves that the walls are solid, that the air recyclers will always hum at that specific, comforting frequency, and that the hierarchy of the hive is as immutable as the stars themselves. I was a filtration operator. My world was defined by the purity of the intake and the stability of the output. It was a clean existence. The air in my station always tasted sterile, recycled 1,000 times, but scrubbed of the lower hive stench. It smelled of static and faint chemical lemon. That was the smell of safety. That was the smell of the Emperor's protection delivered through ducts and vents. I sat in that chair for 12 years. I knew every vibration of the floor plating. I knew the temperaments of the machine spirits and the cogitators. I thought I was part of a great, unshakable machine. I was wrong. The machine breaks. The machine bleeds. And when it does not weep for you. The end of my life began with a sound that did not belong in the catalog of industrial noises. It was not the grinding of gears or the hiss of a pressure valve. It was a thud. A dull, wet impact against the blast doors that separated my sanctum from the maintenance corridors. I remember looking at the tea I had just brewed. The liquid rippled. It was a perfect concentric circle, disturbed by a violence I could not yet see. I did not move immediately. That is the first failure of the civilized mind. We pause. We attempt to rationalize the impossible. I thought it was a piston failure. I thought perhaps a transport servitor had malfunctioned and walked into the bulkhead. I checked my monitors. The lumens in the corridor were dead. The screen showed only static, a gray snow that hissed at me. I stood up. I smoothed the wrinkles in my uniform. I prepared to file a maintenance request. I was so foolish. I was so incredibly small in that moment. Then the smell hit me. It arrived before the enemy did. It seeped through the seals of the blast door, defying the positive pressure of the room. It was not the metallic tang of the hive. It was organic. It was rich and loamy like overturned earth in a grave, mixed with the copper reek of old blood and something sharply chemical like poorly refined promethium. It made my eyes water. It made my stomach turn. It was the scent of a biological landslide. And then came the ozone, the sharp electric bite of ozone that happens when a heavy lascutter breaches a seal. The air turned distinctively sour. The blast door, 3 inches of reinforced plasteel, blessed by the tech priests, began to glow in the center. It turned cherry red, then blinding white. The metal screamed. It was a high-pitched shriek of structural failure that vibrated in my teeth. I stepped back, my hands raised, as if to ward off the heat. I should have run. There was a secondary exit behind the filtration banks. I could have run. But I watched. I watched the order of my world melt into slag. The metal gave way. It did not swing open. It was pushed inward, torn from its hinges, with a force that buckled the surrounding frame. The slab of steel hit the floor with a sound that I felt in my marrow. Dust and soot billowed into the room, instantly coating the pristine white consoles in a layer of grime. Through the smoke they came. They were not men. They were not even the twisted heretics the preachers warned us about. They were mountains of muscle and green flesh, hulking shapes that seemed too wide for the corridor. The noise they made was a wall of sound, a guttural roaring, a chanting that sounded like rocks grinding together. Wah! It wasn't a word. It was a weapon. It was a physical force that battered against my chest. The lead creature stepped over the ruin of the door, was clad in scrap metal plates of iron bolted directly into its flesh or strapped on with thick leather. It carried a weapon that looked like it had been built from the wreckage of a tank, a crude amalgamation of barrels and wires that leaked black smoke. I froze. The training manuals speak of duty. They speak of the guard holding the line. They do not speak of what happens when a civilian, A man whose only weapon is a wrench faces a biological tank. The orc looked at me. Its eyes were small red beads, buried deep under a protruding brow ridge. There was no hatred in those eyes. That is what terrified me the most. If there had been hatred, I would have understood. Hatred is human. Hatred implies a reason. But there was nothing there but a predatory assessment. I was not an enemy. I was an object. I was an obstacle, or perhaps a toy. The creature opened its mouth, revealing tusks, yellowed with age and rot, and let out a bark of laughter that sprayed saliva across my clean console. The violation of my workspace felt more intimate than the violence that followed. This was my altar. This was where I served the throne. And this beast was breathing its spore-choked breath all over it. The shooting started. It wasn't aimed at me, not initially. The orc just squeezed the trigger of its weapon because it enjoyed the noise. Bullets the size of fingers tore through the cogitators. Sparks showered down like a festive display. The hum of the air recyclers died, replaced by the stuttering roar of solid slug fire. I threw myself to the floor. The cold tiles pressed against my cheek. I covered my head with my arms curling into a ball. I prayed. I recited the litany of protection. I whispered the Emperor's name into the dust. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. But the bullets kept flying. Glass shattered. Coolant sprayed over me, freezing cold and smelling of ammonia. I realized then that the Emperor was very far away. He was on Terra. He was a golden light in the sky. He was not here on the floor of Filtration Station Delta 9, where the air smelled of burnt meat and ozone. A hand grabbed me. It was not a hand. It was a clamp of rough, calloused green skin the size of a shovel. It seized me by the collar of my uniform and lifted me effortlessly. My feet dangled a foot off the ground. I stared into the face of the monster. Up close, the smell was overpowering, a mix of sweat fungus and engine oil. The orc shouted something in my face. It sounded like runt or git spittle landed on my cheek. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat had seized shut. My mind was trying to reject the reality of the situation. This was a nightmare. I would wake up in my bunk. I would go to shift. I would check the pressure valves. But the pain was real. The fabric of my uniform cut into my neck. The heat radiating from the orc's body was suffocating. It tossed me aside. I flew through the air and struck the far wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I tasted copper. I lay there gasping, watching them dismantle my world. More of them poured in. They smashed the screens. They ripped panels off the walls just to see the sparks fly. One of them found my tea mug. It crushed the ceramic in its hand, laughing as the hot liquid burned its palm. It didn't care. It seemed to feed on the destruction. They were looting, but not for value. They were looting for the sheer joy of breaking things. They took the hydraulic pistons. They took the copper wiring. They took the very bones of the station. I saw one of them eyeing me again. It wasn't the leader this time. It was a smaller one, though, still larger than any man I had ever seen. It held a length of chain. It walked towards me with a shambling heavy gait. I tried to crawl backward, but my back was against the wall. There was nowhere to go. The chain whipped out. It struck my shoulder, a dull, heavy blow that numbed my arm instantly. I cried out then. A pathetic, thin sound that was swallowed by the roaring of the invaders. The orc grabbed my ankle and began to drag me. I clawed at the floor. My fingernails scraped against the tiles, finding no purchase. I was being pulled out of my sanctuary. I was being dragged over the threshold of the broken blast door. My head bounced against the metal wreckage. I saw the corridor ceiling passing by, lights flickering and dying. I saw the bodies of the security team. They were torn apart. They were just meat now. red, wet shapes on the gray floor. I didn't know them by name, but I knew they were the ones who were supposed to stop this. They were the wall. The wall had fallen. We moved deeper into the facility. The noise of the invasion was everywhere. Explosions shook the floor plates. Alarms were blaring a mournful wail that usually signaled a toxic leak, but now signaled the death of the hive spire. I was not the only one. I saw others being dragged from their stations. Men and women in gray uniforms, bleeding, weeping, or silent with shock. We were being herded. The orcs drove us with kicks and blows from the butts of their weapons. They didn't speak to us. You don't speak to cattle. You just drive them. I lost a shoe. I didn't notice when it happened. I just felt the cold grating against my sock. It seemed like such a small thing losing a shoe. But it was the beginning of the stripping away. First the shoe, then the dignity, then the name. The air grew hotter as we descended. They were taking us down to the maintenance levels, down to the understructure where the heat exchangers vented. The ozone smell faded, replaced by the heavy, suffocating stench of unwashed bodies and exhaust fumes. I tried to stand to walk on my own, but my legs wouldn't support me. I stumbled. An orc behind me kicked me in the spine. I fell again. I learned my first lesson, then do not slow down. Pain is a teacher. I scrambled up, forcing my trembling limbs to move. I looked at the back of the prisoner in front of me. He was bleeding from a head wound. The blood dripped onto his collar, staining the gray fabric black. I focused on that stain. I focused on the rhythm of his stumbling walk. Left, right stumble. Left, right stumble. If I watched the blood, I didn't have to look at the green monsters lining the corridor. We reached the freight elevators. They were massive platforms designed to carry heavy machinery. Now they carried us. We were packed in tight. The smell of fear is real. It smells like sour sweat and urine. It rose from the mass of prisoners choking us. The orcs stood at the edges, grinning, revving their crude chain axes. The platform shuddered and began to descend. The light from the upper levels receded, shrinking into a distant square of white. We were going into the dark. I looked up one last time at that light. I thought of my control panel. I thought of the green system optimal light that I would never see again. The elevator groaned, the gears protesting the weight. Or maybe they were protesting the cargo. We were descending into the belly of the beast. The descent seemed to take hours. In the dark, time loses its meaning. There was only the breathing of the terrified and the low, guttural chuckling of our captors. The platform hit the bottom with a bone-jarring crash. The gates opened. We were not in the hive anymore. We were in a cavernous space that had been hollowed out of the city's foundations. It was lit by flickering orange fires. The shadows danced on the walls, grotesque and elongated. The noise was deafening here. Hammers striking metal, engines revving, roars of anger and triumph. This was the pit. This was where the waff fed. I was pushed out into the mud. It wasn't real mud. It was a slurry of oil waste and dirt. It soaked through my uniform instantly. I lay there for a moment, the ozone of the upper world just a phantom memory now. I was cold, despite the heat of the fires. I was shaking. And as the shadow of a massive orc fell over me, blocking out the firelight, I realized the truth. The machine hadn't just broken. It had been replaced. And I was no longer an operator. I was a component. The darkness wasn't empty. It was hungry. The heat hit us first. It was not the dry, sterile heat of a reactor core, but a wet, suffocating blanket that tasted of sulfur and sweat. We had emerged into a cavern that defied engineering logic. The ceiling was lost in a haze of smog, lit only by the sporadic eruptions of welding torches and the angry orange glow of open furnaces. This was the captive pit. It looked less like a prison and more like a landfill that had come to life. Mountains of twisted metal rose on all sides, bulkheads from ships, tracks from tanks, and the skeletal remains of buildings. But the most terrifying thing was that the scrap was moving. Swarms of smaller green creatures, the runts they called grots, scurried over the piles like insects on a corpse, hammering and screeching. And amidst the metal, there were people. Thousands of them. Humans. They moved in lines, carrying debris, pulling chains their bodies coated in a uniform layer of grime that made them blend into the rusted background. They didn't look like men and women anymore. They looked like components that were slowly wearing out. I was shoved forward. My feet slipped on the greasy floor plating. The noise was a physical assault. It was a chaotic symphony of industry gone mad, the screech of metal on metal, the roar of unshielded engines, and the constant rhythmic thudding of something massive pounding the earth. I tried to cover my ears, but an orc guard slammed the butt of his weapon into my ribs. The message was clear. There is no protection here. You participate, or you break. We were herded toward a low, sprawling structure made of corrugated iron and sheet metal. Steam vented from pipes that looked like they had been shoved randomly into the walls. A sign hung above the entrance, painted in jagged, crude glyphs that hurt the eyes to look at. I didn't know what it said, but I knew what it meant. It meant processing. It meant the end of the person I was. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of searing meat. It was a distinctive, sickly sweet odor that triggered a primal panic in the lizard part of my brain. We were lined up against a wall covered in hooks. One by one, we were stripped. The orcs didn't ask us to undress. They tore the clothes from our bodies. My uniform, the gray fabric with the insignia of the filtration corps, the symbol of my service and my place in the hierarchy, was ripped away in a single motion. I stood shivering, not from cold, but from a profound sense of nakedness that went beyond skin. I was just pale flesh now. Soft, vulnerable, easily bruised human flesh in a world of iron and callous. I saw my uniform thrown onto a pile of rags in the corner. It landed atop a guard flak jacket and a scribe's robe. All ranks were equal here. All ranks were equally worthless. The line moved slowly. Ahead of me, a woman was weeping softly. She kept trying to cover herself with her hands, a reflex of modesty that had no place here. The orc in charge of the station didn't even look at her face. He was a massive brute, his apron stained with oil and old blood, wearing a pair of welding goggles that magnified his eyes into bulbous, unblinking discs. He was the grotty smith. He held a device in his hand that looked like a soldering gun crossed with a staple remover. It glowed with a menacing violet heat. He grabbed the woman's arm. She screamed. It was a short, sharp sound that was instantly swallowed by the factory noise. He pressed the device into her wrist. There was a hiss, a puff of smoke, and then he shoved her aside. She stumbled away, clutching her arm, staring at it in horror. Next, the line shuffled forward. I was one step closer to the fire. I tried to prepare myself. I tried to summon the dignity of a citizen of the Imperium. I told myself I was Elias Coyle. I had a name. I had a history. I had a file in the administratum. They couldn't take that away with a hot iron. But as I watched the man in front of me receive his mark, my resolve began to crumble. The smell of the burning skin was too close. It filled my nose, coating my throat with the taste of trauma. The man didn't scream. He just whimpered a low, broken sound like a kicked dog. He was a big man, muscular, perhaps a dock worker. But he folded inward as the iron touched him. He became small. That was what they did. They didn't just hurt you, they reduced you. They turned you into something that could fit into a cage. Then it was my turn. The grotty smith reached out. His hand was a vise of green leather. He grabbed my left wrist and yanked it forward. I didn't pull back. I knew that would only make it worse, but I couldn't stay silent. I had to say it. I had to speak it into existence one last time before it was burned away. My name, I stammered, my voice sounding thin and pathetic in the cavernous room. My name is Elias Kyle. I am a filtration operator grade 4. The orc paused. He tilted his massive head, the goggles reflecting my terrified face. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. He looked like a butcher looking at a particularly noisy cut of meat. Name, the orc grunted. His voice was like gravel tumbling down a chute. No name. Names is for boys. Names is for fightin'. He tapped the glowing tip of the iron against the metal table, sending a shower of sparks cascading onto my bare feet. You ain't fightin'. You is fixin'. You is hauling. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of rotten fungus and fuel. You is meat with tools. You is a number. He didn't wait for me to argue. He didn't wait for me to plead. There was no negotiation with an avalanche. He brought the iron down. The pain was white. It was absolute. It erased the world. For a second there was no factory, no orcs, no war. There was only the sensation of nerves dying. I felt the metal bite into my skin, searing through the epidermis down to the muscle. I wanted to scream, but my lungs were empty. My mouth opened in a silent gasp. I smelled my own cooking flesh. It was the smell of Elias coal burning away. The orc held it there for a count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Long enough to ensure the mark would never fade. Long enough to scar the bone. Then he pulled it back with a wet, sucking sound. He released my wrist. I fell to my knees, cradling my arm to my chest. I looked down through a veil of tears. The skin was angry and blistered, raised in jagged, ugly welts. The digits were crude, blocky industrial. 7459. I wasn't given time to process the agony. Another orc, this one carrying a bundle of heavy chains, stepped forward. He grabbed my other arm. Fit him, he grunted. He slapped a metal collar around my neck. It was cold, a shocking contrast to the burn on my wrist. He fumbled with the clasp, his thick fingers surprisingly dexterous, and clicked it shut. Then came the cuffs on my ankles, heavy rusted iron that chafed against the bone immediately. They welded the links shut. There was no keyhole. There was no mechanism to release me. This was not a restraint for a prisoner who might be released. This was permanent equipment. I was being bolted into the infrastructure of the Wa, just like a rivet or a plate of armor. I was dragged away from the station, the chains clanking heavily with every step. The weight was immense. It pulled my shoulders down, forcing me into a stoop. I joined the group of the newly branded. We stood in a huddle, none of us speaking. What was there to say? Hello, I used to be a father. Hello, I used to drive a transport. Those people were gone. We were just numbers, now standing in the grime. I looked at the man next to me. He was staring at his wrist. 7460. We were a sequence. We were inventory. The realization settled in my stomach like a stone. The Imperium has billions of souls. To be a number, there is to be one of many faithful. But here, the number was a price tag. They marched us out of the processing shed and deeper into the pit. We passed workshops where sparks flew in showers of gold and blue. We passed pits where strange, squiggly beasts were being roasted on spits. We passed towering idols of the orc gods, built from garbage and dung leering down at us with hollow eyes. The scale of it was crushing. This wasn't a raiding party. This was a city built on the backs of people like me. I saw a group of humans pushing a massive cart filled with artillery shells. They were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their skin gray with soot. They didn't look up as we passed. They just pushed. They had accepted the weight. I wondered how long it took to get like that. Days, weeks. Or did the branding iron take the soul as well as the name? We arrived at the sleeping quarters. It was a hole in the ground, a natural depression that had been fenced off with razor wire and jagged sheets of metal. The floor was dirt and oil. There were no beds, only piles of filthy straw and rags. And the guard shouted, kicking the stragglers. We tumbled down the slope, a tangle of limbs and chains. I landed in the mud. It was warm, heated by the geothermal vents below and the press of bodies. I crawled to a corner, trying to find a patch of wall to put my back against. I needed something solid. I needed a boundary. I curled up, pulling my knees to my chest, the chains rattling softly. Around me, the sounds of the camp began to change. The aggressive roar of the day shifted to a lower, brooding hum. But it wasn't quiet. It was never quiet. There was the sound of coughing, a dry, hacking cough that seemed to be the common language of the prisoners. There was the clinking of chains as people shifted in their sleep. And there was the weeping. Quiet, muffled sobbing from 100 throats. I looked at my wrist in the gloom. The numbers were already beginning to swell red and angry. 7459. I whispered it. 7, 4, 5, 9. It tasted like ash. I tried to say my name. Elias. It felt foreign. It felt like a word from a dead language. The darkness of the pit wasn't empty. It was heavy with the presence of despair. I looked up at the jagged opening of the cavern roof far above. I couldn't see the sky. I could only see the reflection of the fires on the smog clouds. I realized then that the physical walls were the least of my problems. The real prison was the logic of this place. In the Imperium, you serve a purpose. You are part of a plan. Here, you are just fuel. You are something to be used until you break, and then you are melted down to make something else. I touched the cold metal of my collar. It was tight. It pulsed with my heartbeat. Or maybe that was just the fear hammering against my throat trying to get out. I didn't sleep that first night. I listened. I listened to the breathing of the thousands of other components in the pile. I listened to the heavy tread of the orcs patrolling the perimeter. I listened to the sound of my own world ending. The smell of the ozone was gone, replaced entirely by the rust and the rot. I closed my eyes, but the image of the branding iron burned behind my eyelids. I was part of the scrap heap now. And the scrap heap never sleeps. It just waits to be used. The concept of mourning does not exist in the pit. In the hive, mourning was a shift in the lumen strips, a gradual brightening that mimicked the rising sun of a world we could barely see through the smog. Here, mourning is simply the moment the kicking begins. I was woken by a boot to the ribs. It wasn't a warning tap. It was a blow meant to bruise. I gasped, inhaling a mouthful of dust and ash, and scrambled to my feet. Around me, the mound of sleeping bodies erupted into panic. Men and women tangled in their chains clawed at the dirt to stand up before the guards reached them. There is no roll call. There is no breakfast. There is only the noise. The wah wakes up hungry, and it wakes up loud. The engines were already revving, sending tremors through the ground that rattled my teeth. I touched the burn on my wrist. It was weeping, clear fluid sticking to the dirty cuff of my remaining shirt sleeve. The pain was sharp, a high-frequency signal that cut through the dull ache of my muscles. I was alive. That was the only status report I would get. We were herded out of the sleeping pen and toward the workyards. The sky above was a bruise of purple and black, choked with the exhaust of 1,000 unshielded combustion engines. The air tasted of metal shavings. We were pushed into groups not by skill or aptitude, but by proximity. I found myself chained to a line of 20 others. We were a mix of former guardsmen, manufactorum workers, and scribes. It didn't matter now. We were just horsepower. Our task was simple, brutal, and seemingly impossible. A massive slab of plasteel, likely the side armor of a downed Imperial Titan, lay half buried in the rubble. It was the size of a habitation block. Thick chains, their links as wide as my head, were welded to its edges. The other ends were shackled to us. Pull, the overseer bellowed. He was a runthird, a specialized breed of orc, who seemed to derive a sadistic pleasure, not just from violence, but from the degradation of it. He held a whip made of braided electrical cables, the end sparking with live current. I grabbed the cold iron of the chain, my hands used to the delicate touch of pressure. Dials and touch screens were already raw. "Heave," someone whispered hoarsely. We leaned forward. The weight was immovable. It felt like we were trying to drag the planet itself. The chain bit into my shoulder. The collar choked me. I dug my feet into the oily mud, slipping, finding purchase on a buried bolt, and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that sounded like the earth splitting, the slab shifted. It moved an inch. Then two. We were not moving it with strength. We were moving it with desperation. The runthird laughed a wet hacking sound and cracked his whip. The cable struck the back of a man 3 rows ahead of me. I heard the sizzle of flesh and the sharp intake of breath. He didn't fall. He couldn't fall. The chains held him up. If he fell, he would be dragged. So he kept walking his back, smoking. This was the first lesson of the WOG logic, is a casualty. In the Imperium, labor is calculated. The Administratum knows exactly how many calories a worker needs to turn a valve for 10 hours. They know the breaking point of the human spine. There is cruelty, yes, but it is a calculated cruelty designed to maximize output. Here, there is no calculation. The Orks don't care if we die. They don't care if the load is too heavy. If we break, they will just catch more of us. We are a renewable resource. I watched the runthird as we dragged. He wasn't watching our progress. He was watching a squig, a small, ball-shaped beast with teeth, chase a rat under a pile of debris. He was distracted. And then bored, he turned back to us and swung the whip again, aiming for no one in particular, just needing to see movement to hear a sound. It struck the ground, inches from my foot. I flinched, losing my rhythm. The chain jerked me forward, nearly dislocating my shoulder. We dragged that slab for what felt like hours. My world narrowed down to the patch of ground in front of me. Gray mud, black oil, red blood. Repeat. I tried to retreat into my mind. I tried to recall the schematics of the filtration units. Intake valve A connects to scrubber B. But the thoughts wouldn't hold. The pain was too loud. It demanded all my attention. My wrist, the brand, 7-459, was rubbing against the metal shackle with every step. The skin was tearing. I could feel the infection setting and the heat radiating up my arm. I wanted to stop. I wanted to explain to the overseer that I was injured, that a healthy worker is more efficient. The absurdity of the thought almost made me laugh. Explanation. You don't explain things to a landslide. You just try not to get buried. Then the incident happened. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't even a mistake. A woman near the front of the line, a former scribe judging by the ink stains that still lingered on her fingers, simply collapsed. Her legs gave out. It happens. Malnutrition, shock, exhaustion. In a sane world, you would check her pulse. You would give her water. The line stopped. We had to. The weight of the slab anchored us. The sudden stop drew the runthird's attention immediately. He lumbered over the ground, shaking with his tread. He didn't look angry. He looked curious. He poked the woman with the toe of his iron-shod boot. She groaned, trying to push herself up, her arms trembling violently. "Get up," I whispered. "Please get up." The words were a prayer. The orc didn't wait. He didn't shout. He simply raised his weapon, a heavy, crude pistol that looked like a cannon, and fired. There was no hesitation. No warning shot. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap that physically pushed air against us. The woman was gone. There was just a red mist and a crumpled shape in the mud. The line went silent. Even the groans of effort stopped. For a second, the entire pit seemed to hold its breath. The orc looked at the smoking barrel of his gun, then at us. He shrugged. It was a terrifyingly human gesture, a shrug of indifference. Weak, he grunted. Pull. He turned away, scratching his backside. That was it. A life ended not for a crime, but for a pause. A pause in the entertainment. I stood frozen. My brain couldn't process the speed of the transition from life to death. It was too casual. It lacked the ceremony of an execution. It was like stepping on an insect. I stared at the empty space in the line where she had been. The chains were still attached to her body. Pull, the orc roared again, swinging the whip. The man next to me, an older prisoner, with a face that looked like leather, nudged me hard. Don't look, he hissed. His voice was barely audible over the din. Don't look at it. Don't look at him. Eyes down. He grabbed his section of the chain and leaned into it. If you look, they see you. If they see you, they get ideas. I looked down. I forced my eyes to focus on the mud. I grabbed the chain. We pulled. The body of the scribe dragged along with us for a few meters before a grot scurried over to unclip her. I didn't watch that either. I focused on the rhythm. Left foot. Right foot. Pull. I locked the image of her death away in a box in my mind. If I opened it, I would scream. And if I screamed, I would be next. The violence here wasn't a punishment. It was the weather. It was just something that happened like rain or lightning. You couldn't stop it. You could only endure it. By the time the artificial lights dimmed, signaling the end of the shift, my hands were claws. I couldn't fully straighten my fingers. We were given a bucket of water to share among 20 people. It was brown and smelled of rust, but I drank it greedily. It tasted like life. We were herded back to the pen. I slumped against the fence, the cold metal pressing against my spine. I looked at my wrist again. The number was covered in grime, but the outline was clear. 70459. I had survived one day. But as I watched the orcs fighting over a piece of meat near the fires, laughing as they tore each other apart, a cold realization settled in my chest. I hadn't survived because I was strong. I hadn't survived because I was smart. I had survived because the orc happened to look left instead of right. I was alive by accident. And in a world governed by chaos, accident is the only god left. I was pulled from the line on the 4th day. They didn't pick me because I looked strong. I was already withering, my ribs showing through the grime on my skin. They picked me because I had stopped to look at a broken generator. It was a reflex, a ghost of the man I used to be. The generator was sparking, spitting blue arcs of electricity into the mud. I knew it was a capacitor failure. I flinched, anticipating the explosion. A mech boy, one of the engineers of this madness, saw the flinch. To an orc, a human who knows when to duck is a human who understands machines. A heavy hand grabbed my shoulder, the metal claws of a power claw digging into my flesh, just enough to draw blood. You, the creature grunted. You got shiny eyes. You come. I was dragged away from the hauling gangs. I thought it was a reprieve. I thought perhaps my skills would save me. I was wrong. The hauling gangs broke your back. The mech shop broke your mind. The workshop was a cathedral of impossibility. In the Imperium, a machine is a temple. It is built according to the standard template construct. Every bolt has a purpose. Every wire has a prayer. Here, machines were victims. The mech boy's lair was a sprawling mess of stolen technology, welded together in shapes that defied geometry. I saw the engine of a Lehman Russ battle tank jammed into the chassis of a civilian hauler. I saw plasma coils wired into solid projectile cannons. It was technological heresy. The air here was different. It didn't smell of exhaust. It smelled of ozone and frying copper mixed with the sickening sweet scent of the fungus beer the orcs swilled constantly. The mech boy threw me toward a pile of scrap. "Sort," he barked. "Good bits here, bad bits there." He pointed to a heap of jagged metal. I looked at the pile. It was all garbage. Broken cogs, twisted pistons, wires stripped of insulation. But I sorted. I picked up a rusted gear. "Good bit," I whispered. I picked up a bent rod. Bad bit. I was classifying trash to delay my execution. The horror began when I had to assist with a repair. The mech boy was working on a weapon, a massive rotary cannon that looked like it would explode if the trigger was pulled. He was jamming a power cell into a socket that was clearly too small. "Hammer!" he yelled. I handed him a heavy sledge. He smashed the delicate power cell into the slot. Glass shattered. Coolant leaked. By every law of physics I had ever learned, the cell should have ruptured. The thermal runaway should have vaporized us both. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the heat. But there was only a hum, a deep, angry throb of power. I opened my eyes. The weapon was glowing. It was working. The connection was impossible. The circuit was open. But the orc believed it would work, so the universe bent to his will. I felt a wave of nausea. This was not engineering. This was witchcraft. The machine spirit was not being appeased. It was being enslaved. "Red!" the mech boy roared, interrupting my existential vertigo. He pointed a greased finger at a bucket of thick, viscous paint. "Paint it red. Red ones go faster." I stared at him. It was a joke. It had to be a joke. Paint has no aerodynamic properties. Paint does not increase the cyclic rate of a firing mechanism. But the orc was not joking. He was manic, his eyes spinning with a chemical-induced frenzy. I dipped a brush, a stick with human hair tied to the end, into the bucket. I slapped the red sludge onto the barrel of the gun. The mech boy grinned, revealing a mouth full of metal teeth. He pulled the trigger. The barrel spun. And as the red paint slicked over the metal, the spinning accelerated. It whined. It screamed. It spun faster than the gears should have allowed. The friction should have melted the bearings. But it didn't. It just spun faster because it was red. I dropped the brush. My hands were shaking. I had spent my life studying the laws of reality, and here, a monster with a bucket of pigment had repealed them. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself there was a hidden servo, a secondary motor I hadn't seen. But deep down, I knew the truth. The orcs alter reality. Their collective psychic field, their wa acts as a lubricant for the impossible. They don't know how things work, so they force them to work. It was terrifying. It meant that there was no logic I could rely on. I couldn't predict a failure. I couldn't sabotage a machine by cutting a wire, because if the orc didn't notice the cut wire, the machine might keep running anyway. I was trapped in a nightmare where belief was stronger than physics. I looked at the mech boy. He was welding a metal plate directly onto his own arm, searing the flesh, laughing at the smell of his own burning meat. He was a god of this chaotic forge, and I was just a heretic of the order. The days blurred into a cycle of welding, blinding lights and deafening noises. My eyes watered constantly. I learned to spot the good bits, not by their quality, but by how shiny they were. Orcs liked shiny. Orcs liked loud. I stopped thinking about torque and voltage. I started thinking about crump and dakha. The vocabulary of my mind was being rewritten. One afternoon, the mech boy called me over to a new project. It was a box wired with explosives and strapped with a crude timer. He looked at me, then at the box. A cruel intelligence glinted in his eyes. He wasn't looking at me like a worker anymore. He was looking at me like a component. "Need to test," he grumbled. He picked up the box and shoved it into my chest. "Run," he said. "Run fast. See if it goes boom." I stood there, the cold metal of the bomb pressing against my sternum. The timer was ticking. It was a loud mechanical tock, tock, tock that echoed the beating of my heart. I looked at the blast doors of the workshop. They were open. Beyond them lay the mud of the pit. "Run," he roared, revving a chainsaw blade attached to his wrist. I turned. I didn't think about the Emperor. I didn't think about the filtration station. I thought about the red paint. Red goes faster. I didn't have red paint. I only had blood. I ran. I ran toward the open yard, the ticking box in my arms, realizing with a sick clarity that I was no longer a man. I was a delivery system. I was a guidance chip made of meat. And the countdown had already begun. They called it training. That is a human word, a word that implies a syllabus, a progression of skills, a goal of mastery. What happened in the crater behind the mech shop was not training. It was filtration. It was a process of violently shaking the sieve to see which clumps of dirt held together and which crumbled into dust. We were the dirt. There were 50 of us that morning dragged from the sleeping pits before the smog had even turned from black to gray. We were stood in front of a row of vehicles that looked like they had been birthed from a nightmare of metal and spikes. Trucks, buggies, deaf dreads, engines that leaked oil like weeping wounds. The Runtherd paced in front of us, swinging a heavy iron pipe. "Ride," he shouted. "Ride or die." It wasn't a metaphor. They shoved us into the gunner nests and the driver's seats. I was thrown into the back of a truck, a flatbed monstrosity with no suspension and tires taller than a man. My station was a pintle-mounted Shuta, a heavy-caliber machine gun welded to a rusty roll bar. The metal was jagged. It cut my hands as I gripped it. There was no trigger guard. There was no safety. There was just a pedal on the floor and a handle that vibrated with the engine's idle. The driver was an orc, a manic speed freak who was gnawing on the steering wheel, literally chewing the leather in anticipation. Go the Runtherd signaled not with a flag, but by firing a pistol into the air. The orc stomped on the accelerator. The acceleration was violent. It snapped my head back, my neck popping audibly. I slammed against the rear armor plate, the breath driven from my lungs. The world became a blur of brown mud and gray scrap. The truck roared, bouncing over the uneven ground of the pit, catching air slamming down with bone-shattering force. My job, I realized quickly, was not to aim. Aiming was impossible at this speed. My job was to keep the gun firing, to create a wall of noise. "Daka, Daka," the driver screamed, swerving toward a pile of jagged rocks. I stomped on the firing pedal. The gun bucked. The recoil was tremendous, traveling up my arms and shaking my skeleton. Spent casings, hot as coals, sprayed everywhere, burning my bare arms and chest. I didn't flinch. I couldn't. If I let go, the G-force would throw me out of the vehicle. We weren't the only ones. Other vehicles were tearing around the crater in a chaotic orbit. It was a demolition derby, where the passengers were soft, squishy, and expendable. I saw a buggy flip over. It rolled 3 times, shedding armor plates and wheels. I saw the human gunner fly out in a long ragdoll arc. He landed in the path of a battle wagon. There was no swerving. There was just a wet thump lost under the roar of engines. I kept firing. I stared at the muzzle flash, blinding and rhythmic. It was hypnotic. My mind emptied. I stopped worrying about the heat of the barrel searing my palms. I stopped worrying about the centrifugal force trying to tear me from the mount. I just held on. I became a clamp. The lesson lasted for an hour, or maybe a minute. Time dilates when you are terrified. When the truck finally skidded to a halt, smoking and hissing, I couldn't let go of the gun. My fingers were locked in a rigor of cramp. The orc driver hopped out, laughing, punching the air. He didn't look at me. I pried my fingers loose one by one. They were white, the knuckles bruised purple. I looked at my wrist. The scar 70459 was bleeding again, cracked open by the vibration. But underneath the blood, the skin was getting harder. It was turning into leather. The pain was still there, but it felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. I was developing the armor of the damned. We stumbled out of the vehicles. 10 of us didn't get up. They were left where they lay broken on the floor of the crater or slumped over their weapons. The Runtherd walked down the line of survivors. He didn't offer praise. He offered survival. He stopped in front of me, looking at my bleeding hands, then at the smoking barrel of the shooter. He grunted. It was a sound of dismissal, but it wasn't a killing blow. That was the highest honor a prisoner could hope for, to be ignored, because you were adequate. Tomorrow, he said, pointing his pipe at the horizon. Faster. That night, the pain set in. My shoulders felt like they had been dislocated. My ears rang with a permanent high-pitched whine that masked the sobbing of the other prisoners. But I didn't sleep. I watched. In the center of the camp, atop a mound of refuse, something was happening. A figure was dancing. It was an orc, but different. Smaller, twitchier, clad in furs and strange copper fetishes. A weird boy. A psyker. Green lightning crackled around his head, arcing between his copper staff and the ground. The air tasted of ozone again, but not the clean ozone of the filtration plant. This was the ozone of a storm about to break. He was feeding on the on the raw psychic energy of thousands of orcs gathering for war. I watched the green light flicker in his eyes. It was a window into madness. I realized then that the physical torture, the driving, the shooting, the burning, was the easy part. The body can callous, the skin can harden, but the mind, there is no callus for the soul. The wach was a psychic infection and we were drowning in it. I looked at my hands shaking in the dark. I wasn't training to be a soldier. I was training to be a mechanism, a trigger puller, a weight shifter. And as the weird boy screamed at the invisible moon, I wondered if there was enough of Elias Kale left to care. The air in the pit changed before the orders did. It wasn't a shift in temperature, but a shift in pressure. The atmosphere became heavy charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was the wah reaching its critical mass. The weird boy I had seen dancing was now screaming continuously, a high, keening wail that was amplified by crude loudspeakers bolted to the rock walls. The orcs were in a frenzy. They were painting their faces with oil and blood. They were welding final jagged plates onto their vehicles. The industry of the camp had shifted from construction to preparation. There was a terrifying joy in their preparation for war. They were happy. They were like children on the eve of a festival, except their festival was genocide. Amidst this manic celebration, I found myself invisible. The eyes of the masters were fixed on the horizon, on the violence to come. I was just a shadow in the grease moving between the piles of scrap. I found it in the corner of the mech boy's workshop, half buried under a mound of twisted rebar. It was a Voxcaster, a standard-issue Imperial Guard backpack unit. The casing was cracked, the antenna bent at a sharp angle, but the Aquila, the double-headed eagle, was still visible on the faceplate. It was covered in soot, but to me, it shone like a holy relic. I looked around. The mech boy was busy beating a grot with a wrench. The guards were chanting and firing their weapons into the air. No one was watching the shadow. I dragged the unit into the darkness behind a stack of fuel drums. My hands trembled as I touched the dials. They were plastic smooth and civilized, so different from the rough iron levers of the orc machines. I wiped the faceplate with my thumb. "Vox officer," I whispered. I didn't know who had carried this. He was likely dead crushed under the treads of the very machines I had helped repair. But his ghost might still be in the machine. I needed power. The internal battery was dead. I knew it would be. I pulled a loose wire from a nearby bundle of orc electronics, a live feed running to a spotlight. It was dangerous. The voltage was unregulated. It could fry the Vox, or it could fry me. I stripped the insulation with my teeth, tasting the bitter rubber and copper. My heart was hammering against my ribs, loud enough I feared to drown out the noise of the camp. I twisted the wires together. Sparks showered onto my lap, stinging my skin. I didn't flinch. The Voxcaster hissed. A small red light on the console flickered to life. It was weak, pulsing like a dying star, but it was there. I put the headset to my ear. The foam was crumbling against my skin. I pressed the receiver close. Static. A wall of white noise. It sounded like rain. For a moment, I just listened to the hiss. It was beautiful. It was a neutral sound. It wasn't the roar of an engine or the scream of a victim. It was the sound of the void. I adjusted the frequency dial. I moved through the Imperial channels. Command net, logistics, emergency broadcast, click, hiss, click. Nothing. I spun the dial frantically. "This is Elias Kyle," I whispered into the microphone. My voice sounded foreign to me. It was raspy, broken, unused to forming the syllables of High Gothic. "Filtration operator Kyle, requesting transport, requesting acknowledgement." "Is anyone there?" I waited. The static hissed back. Then a sound cut through. It wasn't a human voice. It was a rhythmic, guttural chanting. Orks. They were on the VoxNet. They were flooding the frequencies with their war cries. Their psychic field was bleeding into the radio waves, choking out the signal of the Imperium. I turned the dial again. Screams. Laughter. The grinding of gears. The enemy was not just outside the walls. They were in the air. They were in the very spectrum of light and sound. I realized with a crushing weight that there was no signal to catch. The Imperium wasn't just far away. It was silent. I was a man on a life raft in the middle of an ocean, calling out to a shore that had sunk beneath the waves. I sat there for a long time, the headset pressed to my ear, listening to the cacophony of the wah through the device meant to bring salvation. I thought about the filtration station. I tried to remember the smell of the purified water, the cool, metallic taste of it. But I couldn't. My nose was filled with the stench of promethium and unwashed bodies. My memory was being overwritten. The Voxcaster began to smoke. The Ork power source was too strong. It was melting the delicate Imperial circuits. The plastic casing warped. The red light died. The static cut out, replaced by the dead silence of a broken machine. I took the headset off. I looked at the dead box. It was just garbage now. It had always been garbage. Hope is a cruelty in a place like this. It gives you a destination when you have no legs. I disconnected the wire. I pushed the Voxcaster back into the refuse pile covering the Aquila with a handful of oily mud. I buried it. I buried Elias Kyle with it. The man who believed in rescue was dead. The man who believed that order would return was dead. A horn blew. It was a deep, brassy sound that shook the dust from the ceiling. The engines of the great machines roared to life in unison, a synchronized thunder that signaled the beginning of the march. The ground trembled. Dust fell from the rafters. "Move out, the Runthards!" bellowed their voices amplified by the speakers. "Move out, you runts! Time to stomp!" I stood up. My legs were numb. I walked out from behind the fuel drums and joined the stream of prisoners being herded toward the gates. I didn't look back at the pile of scrap. I didn't look up at the smoke-choked sky. I just looked at the back of the prisoner in front of me. I synced my breathing to the thumping of the engines. If I couldn't speak to the world, I would just have to listen to its end. The transition from the truck to the battlefield was not a deployment. It was a disposal. The ramp slammed down into the mud with a wet thud, and before we could blink, we were being kicked out. The air here was different. In the camp, the air tasted of oil and slow decay. Here, it tasted of ozone and copper, the sharp electric taste of lass fire ionizing the atmosphere. It was the smell of the Imperium. For a split second, my heart leaped. It was the smell of rescue. But then I saw the beams of red light cutting through the smoke, and I realized the lights were not guiding us home. They were trying to incinerate us. The Orks didn't charge immediately. They sent us first. We were the ablative armor. We were the flesh meant to absorb the first volley of discipline, so the green tide could follow in the reload gap. "Run, runts," the slaver screamed, firing his pistol into the mud at our heels. I ran toward the flashes of light. Through the haze I saw them. They were entrenched behind a low wall of sandbags and prefabricated plasteel. They wore the beige flak armor of the Imperial Guard. I saw the double-headed eagle stenciled on a crate. I saw the grim determination on their faces. They looked so clean. Even covered in the dust of war, they looked clean compared to the filth that coated me. I wanted to wave. I wanted to scream. "I am Elias. I am one of you." But I opened my mouth and only a croak came out. And then I remembered what I looked like. I was draped in rags. I was covered in orc glyphs. I was chained to a mob of monsters. To them, I wasn't a citizen. I was just a traitor, a heretic conscript part of the Xenotittle wave. A las bolt hissed past my ear, singing my hair. It was close enough to smell the burning keratin. My own people were trying to kill me, and they were right to do so. We reached the kill zone. The prisoner to my left, the man who had shared his water with me, simply evaporated. A heavy bolter shell caught him in the chest, turning him into a red mist that splattered across my face. I didn't wipe it off. I dove behind the wreck of a chimera transport, shaking, curling into a ball. The noise was deafening, the disciplined crack, crack, crack of laser guns answering the chaotic roar of orc shooters. Suddenly, a shadow fell over me. A Killa Khan, a small walker engine piloted by a grot, stumbled to a halt next to my cover. Its main weapon, a belt-fed heavy shooter, had jammed. Smoke poured from the receiver. The grot pilot popped the hatch, screaming in high-pitched panic. "Fix, fix, stupid human, fix or I smash." He waved a wrench at me. This was the moment. I could have let it be. I could have let the machine stay broken. If I did nothing, the Imperial soldiers might live a few seconds longer. They might even win. I looked at the jammed feed mechanism. It was a simple casing failure. A shell had caught on the lip of the chamber. My hand twitched. It wasn't a decision. It was a reflex. It was the conditioning of the branding iron and the whip. My body was terrified of the grot's wrench. My body wanted to avoid pain. Before my mind could scream no, I had climbed onto the hull. My hands, black with grease, grabbed the hot metal of the barrel. I kicked the feed chute. I yanked the deformed shell free. The mechanism clunked into place. Goodfix the grot squealed and slammed the hatch. The weapon roared. It spun up with a mechanical scream, spitting a torrent of high-caliber shells at the sandbags. I slid off the hull and hit the mud, watching the result of my handiwork. The sandbags disintegrated. The flak armor shattered. The men I had wanted to save were torn apart by the gun I had just repaired. I saw a sergeant, a man who looked like he could have been my neighbor in the Hab block fall, with his chest torn open. He died because I was efficient. He died because I knew how to clear a jam. I lay in the mud, the vibrations of the gun shaking my bones. I didn't feel guilt. Guilt is for people who have choices. I felt a cold, hollow emptiness. I wasn't a traitor. I was a tool. A hammer doesn't choose what it strikes. And as the orcs surged past me, cheering and chopping the survivors, I realized I had become the hammer. The war moved forward, rolling over the horizon like a storm front, but I stayed behind. The orcs have a strange ecosystem of violence. There are those who kill, and there are those who build the monuments to the killing. I was transferred to a construction gang. It wasn't an act of mercy. It was an act of resource management. The mech boy who owned me, and he did own me as surely as he owned his wrench, saw that I had a steady hand with a welding torch. So while the fresh meat was sent to the trenches to catch bullets, I was sent to the rear to build a castle. We were standing in the ruins of a manufactorum, shin-deep in a slurry of mud and pulverized concrete. The sky was a gray bruise, leaking a constant drizzle of acidic rain that hissed when it touched the hot metal of our work. I held a thermal cutter in my hand. It was heavy, vibrating with a low hum. I looked at the sheet of metal in front of me. It was the side plating of a Lehman Russ battle tank. I could still see the stencil of the regiment Cadian 812th. "Weld it," the overseer barked. He was a shorter orc, broad as a barrel, carrying a whip made of braided copper wire. He pointed to a gap in the wall of scrap we were erecting. I didn't hesitate. I didn't salute the fallen tank. I didn't mourn the crew that had died inside it. I just saw a geometric shape that fit the hole. I lifted the cutter. The blue flame roared to life. I pressed it against the sacred armor of the Imperium and began to melt it. The metal wept molten tears. I fused it to a rusted girder from a hive spire. I was desecrating a war grave to build a bunker for Xenos. I watched the sparks fly, mesmerizing and bright. They were the same sparks I used to see in the filtration plant when a fuse blew. But those sparks had meant failure. These sparks meant survival. I finished the weld. It was clean. It was professional. I tapped the slag with a hammer. "Solid," I whispered. I felt a flicker of pride. Then I crushed it. Pride is dangerous. Pride implies you are a person. I was just a machine that joined Thing A to Thing B. The work was endless. We were building a fortress out of the bones of our own civilization. We dragged statues of saints and used them as foundations for gun turrets. We took the pews from a chapel and used them to shore up a trench. Every hour I committed a new heresy, and every hour it became easier. At first I whispered apologies to the God Emperor. "Forgive me, for I must eat. Forgive me, for I do not want the whip." But by the third day the apologies stopped. The silence in my head was deafening. I found myself looking for the best materials, not to honor them, but because they made the job faster. "Use the altar stone," I told the prisoner next to me, a man whose eyes were still wide with fresh terror. "It's marble. It handles compression better than the concrete." He looked at me with horror. He looked at me like I was one of them. "It's an altar," he stammered. "It's holy." I looked at him. I felt nothing. No anger. No pity. Just a dull impatience. "It's a rock," I said. "Pick it up." The sound of the camp became a rhythm I could not escape. The vox casters on the orcs' shoulders were constantly clicking. Click. Hiss. Click. Hiss. It sounded exactly like the cough of my father in the final stages of the black lung. It was a wet, rhythmic sound that used to make me weep. Now it was just the metronome of my labor. I synchronized my breathing to it. Click. Inhale. Hiss. Exhale. I stopped thinking about the war. I stopped wondering if the guard would return to liberate us. I only thought about the structural integrity of the wall. I became obsessed with the strength of the welds. If the wall held, the orcs would be happy. If the orcs were happy, I got food. If I got food, I lived. The equation was simple. It was terrifyingly simple. I was using my intellect, the very thing that made me human, to ensure the safety of the monsters who enslaved me. I was their architect. On the 5th day, a new batch of prisoners arrived. They were being marched past our construction site toward the pits. They were fresh. Their uniforms were torn but still retained color. They hadn't been grayed out by the ash yet. One of them, a young woman with a bandage around her head, looked up at me. I was standing on top of the wall welding a support strut. I was outlined against the sky, a silhouette of industry. She didn't see a fellow prisoner. She saw a figure standing with the enemy building their defenses. She spat on the ground. The spittle landed in the mud far below me. It was a gesture of pure hatred. I watched her being dragged away. I should have felt shame. I should have wanted to jump down and explain to tell her that I had no choice. But I didn't. I just checked the bead of the weld. It was cooling evenly. Good penetration, I muttered. I realized then that the weapon the Orks used against us wasn't the choppa or the shoota. It was apathy. They worked us until the capacity for moral judgment was burned out of our neurons. They made us complicit in our own destruction until we couldn't tell the difference between victim and collaborator. I looked at my hands. They were covered in burns and calluses, the skin thick and unfeeling. They were the hands of a builder. I was building a cage for my own people, and I was doing a good job. I turned off the torch. The flame died with a pop. I sat down on the edge of the wall, my legs dangling over the side. I watched the sun set through the smog. It was a beautiful toxic orange. I took a bite of the fungus bread I had saved in my pocket. It tasted like mold and dirt. I chewed it slowly. The war would continue. The killing would continue. But the wall was straight. And for now, that was the only truth I could handle. There is a specific kind of silence that precedes a disaster. It isn't the silence of peace. It is the silence of a breath being held before a scream. We were digging a trench for a waste pipe, shin-deep in sludge that smelled of chemical runoff and excrement. The work was rhythmic. Dig, lift, throw. My muscles had long since stopped aching. They had simply hardened into wood. Then the rhythm broke. A man 3 places down from me dropped his shovel. It wasn't an accident. The splash was too deliberate. He didn't look at us. He didn't say goodbye. He just looked at the gap in the fence where a section of razor wire had rusted through. It was a small gap, barely wide enough for a dog, let alone a man. But he saw it as a door. He saw it as a way out. I stopped digging. I gripped the handle of my shovel until my knuckles turned white. "Don't," I whispered. "Don't do it." He didn't hear me. Or perhaps he chose not to. He ran. He didn't run like a soldier. He ran like a panicked animal, scrambling on all fours through the mud, his chains dragging behind him like a metallic tail. He hit the fence and began to squeeze through the gap. The metal barbs tore at his rags, tearing at his skin. He didn't care. He was fueled by a desperate, blinding hope. It was painful to watch. It was pathetic. I felt a surge of anger toward him. Not concern. Anger. His hope was an insult to our reality. By running, he was saying that there was somewhere to go. He was saying that we were choosing to stay. He was breaking the unspoken contract of the pit. We accept this hell so that we may survive it. The Orks didn't shoot him. That would have been too merciful and too boring. A slaver noticed the commotion. He didn't raise the alarm. He didn't shout for backup. He just grinned. A wide, toothy grin that split his green face. He nudged the Ork next to him. They watched the man struggle through the wire. They watched him tear his shirt, then his skin. They waited until he was through, until he stumbled out into the open wasteland, beyond the perimeter. Only then did they move. They didn't run. They loped. They released the squigs, small ball-shaped beasts with mouths full of needle teeth. The creatures bounded after the runner, yipping with excitement. It wasn't an execution. It was a hunt. It was sport. We were forced to watch. The guards made us stand at the fence line. Look, one of them barked, pointing a clawed finger. Look at Daw Runner. The man was slow. He was malnourished, weak, and weighed down by iron. The squigs caught him within 100 meters. They didn't kill him. They were trained to hamstring, to slow down. I saw him fall. I heard the scream drift back across the dead ground. It was thin and high, like a bird's cry. Then the Orks reached him. They didn't drag him back. They gathered around him in a circle. I couldn't see what they were doing, but I could see the movement of their arms, the rising and falling of their clubs. It was methodical. It was slow. They were teaching him and us a lesson about the geometry of the world. The world belongs to them. There is no outside. They left him there. They didn't bring the body back to the processors. They left it out in the open, draped over a rock facing the camp. It was a warning, but not the one they intended. The warning wasn't, "You will die if you run." We all knew we would die. The warning was, "Hope hurts more than the chain." I looked at the body. It was just a pile of rags and meat now. He had spent his last moments in terror and agony because he believed in a somewhere else. If he had stayed in the trench, he would still be breathing. He would be miserable, yes, but he would be breathing. I turned back to my shovel. I picked it up. The handle was slick with sweat. I looked at my own chains. The cuffs were welded shut. The metal was pitted with rust, but it was thick. I tested the weight of it against my wrist. I tried to pull just a fraction to see if there was any give. There was none. The metal was absolute. And for the first time, I felt a strange sense of comfort in that unyielding iron. The chain was honest. The chain told me exactly where I was and what I could do. It defined my boundaries. The man who ran had tried to deny the chain, and the chain had crushed him. I wouldn't make that mistake. I dug the shovel into the mud. The sound of the metal slicing the earth was solid and real. I was alive. He was dead. That was the only math that mattered. Time in the whale is not measured in hours or days. It is measured in the erosion of the self. The campaign dragged on a relentless grinding of gears and bones. The initial shock of the capture had faded, replaced by a dull gray fog of routine. I woke up. I worked. I ate slop. I slept. The screams of the dying became background noise, as easy to ignore as the hum of a ventilation fan. I found myself anticipating the rhythms of the workshop. I knew when the mech boy would get angry. I knew when the furnaces would flare. I had become attuned to the heartbeat of the beast. My hands, once soft and suited for keyboards, were now permanently stained with grease and soot. The oil had worked its way into the whorls of my fingerprints, rewriting my identity with a map of grime. I wasn't Elias Kale, the man who liked tea and order. I was the thing that held the wrench. The incident happened on a Tuesday, or what passed for it in this hell. The mech boy was testing a new engine block, a volatile contraption strapped to a test bench with rusty chains. It was running hot, shaking violently, the metal groaning under the stress. I saw the problem before he did. A pressure valve on the coolant line was stuck. The needle on the gauge was buried in the red. The mech boy was too busy hitting the casing with a hammer to notice. If that valve blew, the superheated steam would flay the skin from our bones. It would destroy the engine. It would end the work. I didn't think about the war. I didn't think about the fact that this engine would be used to kill Imperial citizens. I just saw a mechanical error that needed correcting. It was an itch in my brain. I moved. I didn't wait for permission. I slid under the vibrating bench, the heat radiating off the metal, singing my eyebrows. I grabbed the valve wheel. It was searing hot. I could feel my skin blistering, but I didn't let go. I wrenched it clockwise. The metal screeched, resisting, and then gave way. Steam hissed out in a controlled jet, missing me by inches. The shaking subsided. The engine purred, settling into a rhythmic, powerful idle. I rolled out from under the bench, gasping for air, clutching my burned hand. I looked up. The mech boy was staring at me. He wasn't angry. He lowered his hammer. He looked at the engine running smoothly, then back at me. A slow, terrifying grin spread across his face. "Good grotty," he grunted. His voice was low, almost affectionate. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a chunk of meat, something dark and fibrous, likely cured squig. He tossed it to me. "Fix it good." "You eat." I caught the meat. I should have thrown it back. I should have spat in his face, but my stomach cramped with hunger. The smell of the cured meat was overpowering. It smelled like life. I took a bite. It was tough, salty, and tasted of smoke. I ate it while he watched. In that moment, the transaction was complete. I wasn't a prisoner anymore. I was a valued asset. I had saved his machine, and he had fed me. It was a perversion of the social contract. I had just been promoted in the hierarchy of monsters. That night, as I lay in the corner of the workshop, I was allowed to sleep there. Now, away from the general population in the pit, I realized the true extent of my defeat. The smell of the shop, that cloying mix of fungal spores, burnt oil, and ozone, didn't make me gag anymore. It smelled familiar. It smelled safe. It was the smell of the place where I was useful. I looked at the other prisoners when they were marched past for the night shift. They looked at me with hollow eyes. Some looked with envy because I wasn't in chains. Some looked with hatred. They knew. They could see the grease on my face and the meat in my hand. I wasn't just surviving. I was collaborating. I tried to summon the face of the Emperor. I tried to remember the catechisms of hate for the Xenos. Suffer not the alien to live. But the words felt empty. They were abstract concepts from a world that had abandoned me. Here, the reality was the engine. The reality was the valve. The reality was the mech boy who didn't beat me as long as I made the machines run. I closed my eyes and listened to the engine I had fixed. It was still running in the background, a steady rhythmic thumping. It sounded like a heartbeat. And the terrifying thing was, it sounded like my heartbeat. I had become a cell in the Ork organism. I wasn't pretending to be a grotty to survive. I was terrified that I had actually become one. The end of the world did not come with a bang, but with a whistle. It was the sound of Earthshaker artillery shells falling from the clouds, a terrifying descending shriek that pierced the roar of the Wah. We had been marshaled for the final assault on Hive Secundus. The mech boy had strapped a demolition charge to my back, a heavy ticking canister of promethium and scrap code meant to breach the outer wall. Run to wall, he had shouted, shoving me forward. Boom the wall. I was one of hundreds of human bombs, a wave of expendable ordnance. We ran. The ground shook as the Orks charged around us, a green tide of muscle and iron screaming for blood. For a moment, it felt unstoppable. It felt like gravity itself was attacking the hive. Then the Imperial guns opened fire. It wasn't a battle. It was a deletion. The air turned into fire. I saw the front rank of the Ork charge simply disappear, vaporized by heavy bolter lines and las cannon fire. The invincible war boss, the monster who had seemed like a god of violence, was cut in half by a tank shell. His body exploded in a shower of spores and wet meat. I dove into a crater, the bomb pressing painfully into my spine. I curled up, covering my head with my hands. Around me, the Wah was dying. The Orks, confused by the volume of fire, began to falter. They turned on each other, blaming the nearest weakling for the failure. I watched a knob decapitate a smaller Ork in a fit of frustration before being blown apart by a mortar round. It was chaotic. It was pathetic. The great green beast was just meat after all. I lay in that crater for hours. The shelling stopped, replaced by the eerie silence of the dead. The smoke was so thick I couldn't see the sky. I was covered in ash, gray, clinging ash that tasted of burnt plastic. I checked the timer on the bomb. It had stopped. A dud. Or maybe I had forgotten to arm it. It didn't matter. The wall still stood. The Imperium had won. But no one came to check the craters. No commissars walked the field to execute the survivors. The defenders stayed behind their walls, content that the threat was broken. I was left alone in the graveyard of the invasion. I looked at the twisted metal of a death, Dreadit's pilot dead inside the machine, silent. I felt a strange hollowness in my chest. I wasn't relieved that the Imperium had held. I wasn't sad. The Orks had lost. I was just tired. The grand narrative of the war, good against evil, order against chaos, had collapsed into a pile of smoking garbage. I crawled out of the crater as the sun began to set. The light was blood red, filtering through the haze. I saw other shapes moving in the wreckage. Grots, human slaves, the survivors of the suicide wave. We looked at each other. There were no guards left to beat us. The Runthords were dead. We were technically free. We could have run toward the hive. We could have waved white flags. But we didn't. We looked at the distant, imposing walls of the Imperial city bristling with guns. We knew what would happen if we approached. They wouldn't see refugees. They would see traitors. They would see tainted goods. We were marked by the Xenos. We belonged to the outside now. One by one, without speaking, we turned back. We turned back toward the camp, back toward the pit. It was a moment of absolute crushing defeat. Not military defeat, but spiritual defeat. We chose the devil we knew. We chose the chains because the chains came with a purpose. I adjusted the strap of the dud bomb on my back. It was heavy, but it felt right. I started walking back through the field of corpses. I stepped over the body of an orc. I recognized the one who had kicked me on my first day. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt the cold wind on my skin. The war had killed everything: the soldiers, the monsters, and the man I used to be. All that was left was the debris. The camp was quiet when we returned. The fires were low, fed only by the few surviving grots who were terrified of the dark. The great engines of the Wa sat silent, half-built or half-destroyed. The masters were gone dead in the field or retreated deep into the Badlands to regroup. It was just us, the refuse, the leftovers. I walked into the mech boys' workshop. It was empty. The tools lay where they had been dropped. The half-finished projects gathered dust. I walked over to a sheet of polished metal hanging on the wall armor plating for a knob who would never wear it. I looked at my reflection. I didn't recognize the creature staring back. It was gaunt skeletal with skin the color of old parchment stained with oil. The hair was gone, burned away, or fallen out from stress. The eyes were sunken dark pits that held no light. But the most terrifying thing was the posture. I wasn't standing like a man. I was stooped. My shoulders were hunched forward, anticipating a blow that wasn't coming. My arms hung low, the hands curled into permanent claws, ready to grab a wrench or a scrap of metal. I looked at the brand on my wrist. 7459. It was the only clean thing on me. It was the only thing that defined me. Elias Kyle was a ghost. He had died in the filtration plant. This creature, this was a grotty, a thing of the scrap heap. I looked around the workshop. There was work to do. The generator was sputtering. The ventilation fans were clogged. The surviving orcs would return eventually, or new ones would come. They always came. War is a fungus. It grows back. And when they returned, they would need weapons. They would need walls. They would need me. I picked up a wrench from the floor. It felt heavy, cold, and reassuring. It was an anchor. I walked over to the generator. I didn't think about escape. I didn't think about the Emperor. I thought about the intake valve. It was loose. It needed tightening. I started to work. The sound of the wrench turning the bolt was loud in the silence. Clank, clank. It was the only sound in the world. I found a rhythm. I let the motion take over. My mind emptied of fear, of hope, of memory. There was a terrifying peace in it. To be a tool is to be free of the burden of choice. A hammer does not worry about the morality of the nail. A cog does not dream of the machine's purpose. I was part of the mechanism now. I was essential. I was safe. A Vox unit in the corner, miraculously still functional, crackled to life. It wasn't a message. It was just the background radiation of the Ork network. A rhythmic, distorted clicking. Click, click, hiss. It sounded like a heartbeat. It sounded like home. I hummed along with it, a low, tuneless sound that vibrated in my chest. The sun rose outside, illuminating the vast wasteland of scrap, but I didn't look up. I kept turning the wrench. The work was there. The work was eternal. I was 7 to 459, and I was free.